Hey, what is going on guys? Danny here, welcome back to the channel. For this video, I wanted to start off with a little story of mine from the past. So about 3 years ago, one of my really close friends approached me and told me he was interested in building a gaming PC because he wanted to get into PC gaming. But he didn't have much knowledge about how to go about doing so, which parts to use, and how to work with a budget. So he asked me if I could help him out in the process, and I told him sure, why not, I'd be happy to help. I told him about all the different parts he would need to complete his build, such as which CPU he should buy, the RAM he should pair with that CPU, which GPU he should use, power supplies, cases, basically all the essentials. Now he was going for a basic budget $500 build that would allow him to play games at 1080p 60Hz with medium to high settings, nothing crazy, and at the time mostly what he played consisted of CSGO, some indie games, and emulators. Things that can be run on some pretty low-end hardware anyways. Now while helping him choose his processor, we ended up going with the Haswell i3-4170 since he had gotten a solid deal on a great Z87 motherboard. At the time we felt like it was better for him to go with an Intel processor since it had a much better upgrade path. Now while AMD did offer some great options for budget builds back then like the FX 6300 or the Athlon X4 860K, they didn't offer a good upgrade path. If he wanted to upgrade to a better CPU in the future, all he would have to do is drop in an i7 4790K into his motherboard and call it a day, which was a CPU that was miles ahead of the FX 8350 or the best CPU for the FM2 Plus socket. Now our local hardware store carried the processor, so we ended up driving down there to pick it up. We went over to the section where they had all the CPUs locked up in glass showcases and told a store associate which one we wanted. While waiting for him to get the CPU, we started to browse around and look at other products. While looking around, we came across the Intel Extreme Edition Core i7-5960X, an 8-core 16-thread monster at the time. And that processor had an associated price tag of around 1,400 Canadian dollars, or something like that. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but it was something close to that. But anyways, we both talked about how awesome it would be to have a CPU like that in our gaming PCs, but both agreed how $1,400 for a CPU was absolutely crazy, at least for our use cases that is. So we ended up getting the i3-4170 and we happily went about our business and continued with this PC build. But still, ever since that day, I couldn't help but wonder when us, the mainstream consumers, would see processors like the 5960X in their systems. How many years would it take for these HEDT CPUs to trickle down to the mainstream segment, and what kind of processors we would see in that segment to replace them? Fast forward a couple years to 2017, and I had gotten a Ryzen 7 1800X, an 8-core 16-thread processor, and my friend ended up getting the Ryzen 5 1600, a 6-core 12-thread processor. It's funny because just 2 years ago, we dreamed about having these types of processors in our system, but didn't think that would be possible until many years down the line. So the point that I wanted to make from this story was that take a look back at the last few years and compare that to where we are now. The landscape of the CPU market has completely changed in such little time. I got into building PCs back in 2008, and the very first processor that I bought was the Intel Core 2 Quad Q6600. This was around the time when quad-core processors started to become more mainstream, because before then, most of the CPUs in this segment consisted of dual cores, and the very first quad-core CPUs like the QX6700 retailed for around $1,000 US a year prior. And even the Q6600 initially launched at a really high price of around $800, but quickly came down a year later. I was quite astonished by the performance of the CPU and what it was capable of, because before that, I was using a pre-built computer that was using a Pentium D processor. Interestingly, the Q6600 was using a dual 2-core die design similar to Ryzen's multi-CCX design. So I thought it was pretty funny to see that 10 years later, I'd be using a processor with a similar setup. At the time, these quad-core CPUs were considered to be top of the line, and basically the consensus was that if you had one of these CPUs, you would be set for a very long time. And I think Intel ended up treating this statement as some religious mantra for many years, as their behavior the following 9 years would reflect just that. I won't be diving into a whole history lesson of what each manufacturer has released over the years since then, because then this video would go on forever. But since then, Intel has followed a fairly steady approach as to what processors they would be releasing in the coming years since the debut of the first Core i series, starting with the Bloomfield i7-920. From the Core i7 down to the i3, these were dual and quad-core processors that were mostly targeting the mainstream segment, with most of the SKUs differentiating between clock speeds, unlocked multipliers, and whether it was a dual or quad-core with hyper-threading enabled or disabled, with core count staying stagnant with each generation afterwards up until recently, but more on that later. Now AMD, on the other hand, was doing things differently and had taken on a proactive approach where they were implementing a more forward-thinking design with their desktop processors. AMD with their Phenom chips were considered to have the first true quad-core CPUs to the market, as they were using a monolithic multi-core design unlike the Core 2 Quad series. Then with the Phenom 2 processors, we saw the bump in available amount of L3 shared cache, frequency, and the introduction of a 6-core variant with the X6 1055T. Then in 2011, AMD launched the FX series of processors based on the infamous Bulldozer architecture, popularly known as Faildozer within the community. The Bulldozer CPUs were using a cluster multi-threading design, which allowed the processor to use a dual integer setup per module. So the 8150, which was using 4 modules, would be recognized as an 8-core processor by the operating system, but it technically didn't have full-on 8 cores. Without going into too much detail, the concept, although intriguing, just didn't end up working out too well for them at the time for the majority of real-world scenarios, and these processors got absolutely thrashed by Intel's Sandy Bridge line of processors. And in some scenarios, the FX series also lost to AMD's previous Phenom 2 processors, which was, well, quite laughable. And unfortunately, it just didn't make sense to buy them over Intel's offerings. It wasn't until over the past couple of years, though, where we saw the true potential of the FX processors, but by this point, it was already set and done and their reputation was tarnished. Since then, competition in the CPU market was basically absent. Going back to what I said about Intel taking on a consistent, steady approach, since Sandy Bridge and onwards, what we saw were very minor and incremental improvements with each generation. IPC improvements were minimal with each of the following generations. The configurations of the Core i3, i5, i7 with respect to core and thread counts remained the same, with the i3 being a dual-core processor with hyper-threading targeted towards the low-end budget builds, with the 4-core 4-thread i5 considered to be the best gaming CPU at the time, and the i7 with hyper-threading targeted towards someone with more use cases like light video editing or streaming. And of course, we did see Intel also have a segment above that, known as the HEDT segment, and the situation there was even worse, as AMD had absolutely no answer for that segment. So that market was also quite slow when it came to advancements, simply because Intel didn't have to innovate. There was no competition for them, they could just keep selling the same processors with minor improvements with each generation, just like what they were doing with the mainstream segment. With the Haswell E processors, we saw them up the core count to 8, but that didn't come without a hefty price tag, because again, they could charge whatever as there were no other competing products. Now with the further revisions such as Piledriver and Excavator, AMD did fix some of the shortcomings of the Bulldozer line of CPUs, but it just wasn't enough to compete with Intel, and Intel kept on slowly widening that gap with each generation. The shittiest thing about this entire situation was that regardless of little changes with each generation, prices were either the same or they were increasing marginally because Intel knew their stuff would sell since they were basically the only player in this segment, and that goes for older processors as well. I don't want anyone to take me the wrong way though. I didn't think the FX series were absolutely horrible. I thought they still had a place in the market. Like for example, they still offered pretty decent value for low-end budget builders. I had an FX 6300 which I used for quite a while, and it was serving me pretty well for most of my uses at the time. But if someone wanted more for an editing build, a gaming PC that targeted high frame rate gaming, that didn't bottleneck high-end graphics cards, they were left with one option, Intel. I'm also not saying that the lack of innovation was solely because of AMD, that because of them, Intel didn't have to innovate. Because while Intel didn't have an incentive to push a newly designed product out to the market, it doesn't necessarily mean they should have stopped innovating altogether or decreased R&D. Don't use AMD's absence from the market as an excuse to that. The GPU market was a lot more competitive than the CPU market, that's for sure, but Nvidia was still ahead in many ways when compared to the Radeon Technologies group. but that still didn't stop them from widening the gap even more. I believe that Intel feeding the mainstream consumers quad cores at the same prices for the better part of a decade was unacceptable. So since 2011 to the end of 2016, this was the boring state of the CPU market. AMD was pretty much absent, with Intel releasing newly revised lineups based on the same core architecture with minor improvements, with a chipset update every couple of generations to support newer features like NVMe drives, wireless AC, DDR4 memory, USB Type-C, Thunderbolt, and etc. Not a whole lot to be excited for, and if you had gotten a CPU from that time, like an i5, there wasn't a whole lot to entice you to upgrade. A lot of people agreed that an i7 2600K was probably one of the best investments anyone could have made, as that CPU still remains relevant even today. Now, at the start of 2017, things were about to get really shaken up. Intel had just launched their 7th generation Kaby Lake processors, which were essentially just overclocked Skylake CPUs. At this point, many people, including myself, were absolutely sick and tired of seeing the same quad-core crap over and over again, and we wanted something new and exciting. In February of 2017, AMD had answered our prayers by releasing their highly anticipated Ryzen CPUs based on their all-new Zen architecture. Now, these CPUs had really shaken up the market because they were offering up to full-on 8-core, 16-thread processors, which offered performance comparable to what Intel had on their high-end desktop segment at mainstream prices, which I thought was mind-blowing at the time, but came to the realization that this could have been possible a long time ago. But Intel decided to gouge the consumer and milk their quad-core CPUs as much as possible. With that, AMD had been saying they were targeting a 40% IPC improvement over their previous architecture, but on launch day, they had informed everyone that they had beaten that goal, and IPC improvements were up to 52%. So IPC-wise, AMD wasn't too far behind either, and you could use these processors in a gaming build and not have to worry about bottlenecks. I mean, for the better part of a year, I've been using my 1080 Ti with my Ryzen 7 1800X, and I've never thought to myself, geez, an i7 8700K at 5 GHz would sure be nice to have. With my FX 6300, things were different. Once I had upgraded to an R9 390, I realized just how bad of a CPU bottleneck I had, because in many games, it was not that much faster than my R9 270X. So I had to upgrade from the FX processor to a Skylake i5 6600K to allow that 390 to really stretch its legs. When Ryzen came out, I saw this picture somewhere on Reddit, I think, that showed a Ryzen 7 1700 complete PC build from Newegg for around $1,100 next to a Core i7 6900K just by itself, which at the time retailed for around the same price. And that picture pretty much said it all and really put things into perspective. So later in the year, we saw AMD release the Ryzen 5 and Ryzen 3 CPUs. We had seen 6-core, 12-thread processors for the price of what quad-core i5s were going for, and we saw quad-core Ryzen CPUs in i3 territory, completely altering the landscape of the mainstream segment, defying what we had accepted as the norm. It was like a whole new paradigm shift. And this was great because there was finally something to be excited about, and consumers had all of these great new options to choose from. Now, Intel had planned for the release of their next 7th generation Skylake X HEDT processors as usual. This is how they've done things, where these processors will follow after the release of their mainstream processors. With how AMD took the market by storm, people were anticipating a huge response back from Intel, but what we ended up getting was a poor rushed launch with clear last-minute changes to the lineup. It was intended that their new X299 platform would have the inclusion of a new 12-core CPU. But because of the threat from AMD, they decided to say screw it, we'll rebrand our Xeons as i9s and throw them in there as well, just to make it look like we were working on a whole new product stack. Not to mention, they all didn't support the same amount of PCIe lanes. The CPUs also ran extremely hot, consumed a lot of power, and didn't offer that much better performance over the Ryzen counterpart CPUs, especially considering they cost a lot more when taking into account not just the CPU prices, but also a much more expensive X299 motherboard. Also, what the hell was the point in adding those Kaby Lake X CPUs? They hardly offered anything useful over their mainstream counterparts. They were more expensive, could not fully utilize the X299 platform when it came to memory configurations and PCIe lanes. I remember seeing a benchmark done by Steve over at Hardware Unboxed where he showed a Ryzen 5 1600X showing nearly identical performance in terms of gaming to the i7 7800X. I honestly thought that Intel's response with Skylake X was a complete shitshow and was pretty disappointed in them because it was clear that for years they were sitting around doing absolutely nothing when perhaps many thought they were just sitting on something big but didn't have the incentive to release it. We then later saw AMD's entry into the high-end desktop segment with their Threadripper platform. This platform offered many of the similar features offered by Intel's high-end platform. Most notably, it offered support for higher core count CPUs, quad-channel memory, and more PCIe lanes. Again, AMD was just on a roll here because just like their mainstream Ryzen CPUs, these new Threadripper CPUs were offered at much lower prices when compared to Intel's offerings. Their top-of-the-line Threadripper 1950X offering 16 cores, 32 threads for just $1,000. A year before that, you would never be able to get that sort of CPU for that low. The best you would be able to get would be an 8-core processor, which was even more expensive. For less, you now have a processor that doubles the core and thread count there. And keep in mind, a lot of these prices I've shown so far were prices that were unveiled at launch, and now things have changed even drastically. For example, a Ryzen 7 1700 currently on Amazon is $209, and just a few days ago, I saw a post from the Build a PC sales subreddit that the processor was on sale for just $160 on Newegg. If you had come up to me 3 years ago in that computer shop and told me that I'd be able to get an 8-core 16-thread processor like that 5960X for just $160, I would have laughed in your face and thought you were an escapee from some mental asylum. Because that is just how much disbelief I would have had. Because it's crazy to see that we're talking about an 8-core processor in what was once known as the dual-core i3 and quad-core i5 territory. But here we are now, where someone wanting to build a mid-range PC can even have 8 cores and 16 threads in their system. No longer do you have to shell out over $1,000, no longer do you have to pay multiple hundreds of dollars for a premium motherboard. RAM prices are still out of whack, but that's completely due to other factors. Also, take a look at the Threadripper 1950X. It's currently around $700 to $800 on Amazon. I probably sound like a broken record at this point, but I'm still in awe about just how much the market has changed. Now with Coffee Lake, Intel's 8th generation series of processors for the mainstream, there were many rumors floating around for quite a while that Intel was planning on finally giving the mainstream more cores. Coffee Lake was originally set to launch in the first quarter of 2018. But because of Ryzen, they ended up pushing to an earlier date. Sort of. I actually made a video about this a year ago where I talked about some of the things Intel could have done to gain back some popularity, most of which consisted of offering more cores for the mainstream, allowing for unlocked multipliers, and ensuring backwards compatibility with older motherboards, if not all, at least the higher end ones people paid a lot of money for. With Coffee Lake, Intel did change up their core and thread count associated with the i3, i5, i7 CPUs. The i7 8700K offering 6 cores and 12 threads, the i5 offering 6 cores, 6 threads, and the i3s being full-on quad cores with no hyper-threading. Intel didn't increase their core and thread counts to directly counter AMD's higher core count CPUs, but they still held that slight IPC advantage, and their CPUs would also clock higher, so there was that advantage there. While the Coffee Lake CPUs were generally received by the tech press as a good step in the right direction and a good competitive response to Ryzen, there were some drawbacks and unfavorable constraints. For starters, not all the CPUs were unlocked. They kept that same old locked and unlocked segmentation with this generation as well. Also, if Intel releasing a new mainstream generation of processors only like 10 months after Kaby Lake felt like a slap in the face, then what added salt into the wound was the fact that Coffee Lake CPUs would not be compatible with the 100 and 200 series chipsets. I still kept my Skylake system after I had upgraded to an 1800X because I had thought to myself, if I could extend that system's life by adding a 6-core part, then that would be great. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case, and I ended up selling that system as I thought investing any more money into that dead platform would be pretty dumb. And I also just wasn't utilizing that secondary system as much as I thought I would. Apart from the missed opportunity of features, Intel's launch was also somewhat bizarre, as initially, stock of the Coffee Lake CPUs was very low. Along with that, CPUs had only launched with the more expensive Z370 chipset motherboards, and cheaper chipset motherboards weren't here until the first quarter of 2018. So those looking to get the cheaper i5-8400 or i3-8100 wouldn't have found themselves building good value systems, as those CPUs couldn't be overclocked, which made no sense pairing them with a more expensive Z370 motherboard. But when you have no other option, what else can you do? Don't get me wrong, I'm not hating on the Coffee Lake CPUs. I think they offer excellent performance, and you wouldn't really go wrong buying one, but it's just that Intel keeps making these dumbass decisions that really piss off a lot of their customers, like applying toothpaste to the CPUs, or not allowing unlocked multipliers, which only makes AMD's products look more attractive. In the first quarter of 2018, we saw AMD release their first set of APUs based on the Ryzen platform, known as Raven Ridge. Now with these APUs, I was quite impressed because although they weren't packing massive amounts of processing power, it was with the inclusion of EVGA graphics that made these chips so intriguing. The reviews of these products show comparable performance to a low-end discrete GPU like the GT 1030 or RX 550, which was excellent because the GPU is right on the die next to the CPU cores. They're a great all-in-one package, and they were priced very well too. And I'm sure many appreciated these APUs because they were released during the time of the mining boom. Graphics cards from the low to high-end segment were scarce and overpriced. With these APUs, one could build an entry-level gaming PC without the need for a graphics card. Sure, you wouldn't be playing at high settings at 1080p for every single title, but they were still a viable choice for the low end. Moving along to the second quarter, and we saw AMD release the second generation of Ryzen processors. The Pinnacle Ridge series of processors weren't a huge leap over the first generation Ryzen processors. It was more of a refresh on their 12nm node. But there were some decent improvements regarding cache and memory latencies, higher clock speeds, and better overall memory compatibility. AMD had also further refined XFR, and with the inclusion of Precision Boost Overdrive, the second gen Ryzen CPUs did a much better job at retaining their boost clocks. So much so that the consensus was that overclocking could cause performance regression in some situations where single core performance was particularly important. We also saw much better launch pricing with the newer generation when compared to the launch prices of the first generation. AMD was very aggressive here, but retailers seem to be offering many deals which still make the first gen processors a viable choice. The second gen processors are also compatible with the older X370, B350, and A320 chipset motherboards, provided you update the BIOS, so that's nice. Not bad for a refresh, and if someone who is perhaps using a lower count Ryzen 3 1200 and wanted to upgrade to a higher core count CPU like a 2600X or 2700X, well, that would make for an excellent upgrade. Computex 2018 was after that, and we saw Intel showed off new products, technologies, partner products like laptops and ultra-thin and lights. Most notably were when they talked about the i7-8086K and the 28-core demo. The former was just a limited edition binned 8700K rebranded for their anniversary promotion, which has a turbo speed of 5 GHz out of the box. The 28-core demo was the real highlight of the show. While impressive on the surface, and Intel saying they'll bring that processor later to the market this year, it wasn't until after some investigating that many had discovered it was a heavily overclocked CPU using an extremely exotic industrial cooling solution and using a monstrosity of a motherboard. Completely deceptive. Honestly, at this point, you can only laugh at Intel as they fumble the ball countless times trying to prove they're still on top. Meanwhile, AMD at Computex had announced a 32-core second-gen Threadripper CPU. They had showed off the CPU in a couple of impressive demos while subtly making some jabs at their competitor by showing that all they needed was simple air cooling to get the job done. Another thing at Computex that really stuck out to me was when Lisa Su came onto the stage and talked about Zen 2.
So today, for the first time, I can give you an update. Number one, we have 7nm Zen 2 in the labs, and it's looking really good. We will be sampling 7nm EPYC very, very shortly, and we will launch in 2019. So today, I would like to show you the first AMD Zen 2 processor, AMD EPYC 2nd generation.
AMD hasn't looked this great in a very long time. While they're pushing on ahead, there have been many reports about Intel's 10nm node being a complete wreck. I'll leave some links about that in the video description if you want to read up on it, or I'll probably make another video about that topic specifically, as this video has gotten much longer than I had anticipated. Right, so after all this rambling, I'll finally move on to summing things up here. What I'll say is that competition is now finally back in the CPU market. Consumers have all these great options to choose from, depending on what they're mainly going to be using their PC for. For much of the duration of the last decade, choices were very limited, and prices, in my opinion, got to the point where I felt like most were overpaying for quad cores. But like I said earlier, that's all changed, where even at mid-range prices, one can possibly attain a powerhouse of a CPU sporting 8 cores and 16 threads, which was just unheard of before the previous year. So it's just absolutely astonishing to see where we were at the beginning of the decade, and what happened when competition was absent, and then finally how the landscape got changed thanks to AMD, and things will only get better from here on out. Consumers, gamers, enthusiasts, whoever you are, keep your eyes peeled for the next 12 to 18 months. While Intel is still trying to work out their next node, AMD is not letting up their foot on the gas pedal. From all that we've heard so far, their next generation Zen 2 architecture looks to be pretty promising. But not only that, in a very long time, we'll see the flipping occur in the CPU market, where AMD will overtake Intel after a very long time, as they'll hold a node advantage over them. Things are going to continue to become more competitive going forward, and that's excellent. This is what we should be hoping for in any market. As companies will be innovating, products will become better, prices should become reasonable and competitive, and in the end, we, the consumers, are the winner. Thank you all for watching the video. Leave your thoughts down below. I'd love to hear your outlook on what you think about this changing CPU market. If you're interested in more content like this, then make sure you're subscribed. Take care, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.